Hello there. Tonight we begin with a journey into another time, another world, a place that has been painted in films, poetry, and legends as mysterious, beautiful, and noble. Feudal Japan. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine mist curling through green mountains, cherry blossoms drifting across a still pond, and wooden houses with sliding paper doors. The air is calm, yet underneath the beauty lies a society built on discipline, hierarchy, and struggle. Feudal Japan lasted for centuries, stretching roughly from the late 12th century until the mid-19th century. And during that time, life was nothing like the romanticized images we often picture. Yes, there were samurai in shining armor, castles perched on hills, and rituals like the tea ceremony that still fascinate us today. But behind those images was a system where survival was hard, rules were unbending, and a single mistake could mean ruin, dishonor, or even death. The term feudal itself means a system of lords, vassals, and land tied together by loyalty and obligation. Japan's feudal structure was a strict pyramid. At the top sat the emperor, more symbolic than powerful, almost like a divine figure. Below him, the shogun, the military ruler, held the true power. The shogun commanded daimyo, feudal lords who each controlled their own domains. Beneath them stood the warriors, the samurai, sworn to protect and serve. And then came the peasants, artisans, and merchants who made up the backbone of society. At the very bottom there were outcasts, people deemed unclean, forced into jobs like handling the dead or working with leather. What does this mean for someone living there? It meant that from the moment you were born, your destiny was not your own. If you were born a peasant, you would likely die a peasant, bent over in muddy rice paddies, taxed to the point of exhaustion. If you were born a samurai, your life would be filled with honor, but also with constant fear of disgrace. If you were born a woman, your life was tied to family duty, marriage arrangements, and the silent endurance of hardship. And yet, despite the harshness, feudal Japan was a land of breathtaking contrasts. While warlords battled for power, poets wrote delicate verses about the moon. While peasants worked tirelessly in the fields, they found solace in festivals and seasonal rituals. While strict rules governed behavior, people carved out small spaces for joy, laughter, and resilience. But here is the truth, and why the title of tonight's story makes sense. You probably wouldn't last a single day in feudal Japan. Why? Because every aspect of life demanded endurance, patience, and obedience to systems we would find suffocating today. Imagine waking up before dawn to toil endlessly, only to see most of your harvest taken by the Lord's tax collector. Imagine living with the knowledge that speaking out against authority could cost you your life. Imagine a society where you had no choice in who you married, where you lived, or even what you could wear. The beauty of Japan's mountains and temples might catch your eye, but the reality of life there would wear you down. And yet this is precisely what makes the story of feudal Japan so fascinating. The resilience of its people, the strict codes of honor, the rituals of daily life, and the delicate balance between cruelty and grace. Tonight, I invite you to step into the sandals of those who lived in this world. Imagine yourself as a humble villager in a wooden house with a thatched roof, rising with the sun to tend rice paddies, hoping for enough food to make it through the winter. Or perhaps you are a samurai bound by the rigid code of Bushido, carrying not only a sword, but also the heavy weight of honor. Or maybe you are a merchant in the city, clever and ambitious, but still looked down upon by the warriors above you. Each path comes with its own struggles, and each life would test you in ways modern comforts have softened us against. As we move through this story together, you'll see just how demanding this world was, and why even the strongest among us today might falter in its relentless rhythm. So settle in. Tonight we journey through the bamboo forests and castle towns, through rice fields and battlefield plains. We will walk with peasants, dine with samurai, bow before lords, and glimpse the hidden corners of a society both beautiful and brutal. And perhaps by the end, you will find yourself with a new appreciation, not only for the endurance of those who lived then, but also for the world we inhabit now. A world where survival doesn't hang on the edge of a sword. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on the shores of an island nation, thousands of miles away from the great continents of Asia and Europe. Behind you are green mountains rising steeply into mist, their slopes lined with cedar and pine. Before you stretches the endless sea, a restless grey blue that seems to guard the land as much as it isolates it. This is Japan during its feudal age, a world both breathtakingly beautiful and unforgivingly harsh. Geography shaped everything here. Japan was not one flat plain where armies could sweep through freely, nor was it an endless desert. Instead, it was a country of islands carved by mountains and volcanoes, cut through with rivers and fringed by coasts where fishing villages clung to survival. Only a small fraction of the land could be farmed, and yet rice became the lifeblood of the nation, the measure of wealth and the backbone of survival. If the harvest was good, life could be sustained. If it failed, famine could come quickly, taking thousands of lives with it. Isolation also played its role. For much of its history, Japan existed in relative seclusion. Though influences from China and Korea brought writing, Buddhism, and new technologies, Japan often turned inward, building a society that was unique, refined, and tightly controlled. That isolation created beauty. Traditions like haiku poetry, no theatre, and Zen gardens blossomed in ways they may not have elsewhere. But it also meant that the people depended almost entirely on what their own islands could provide, and when disaster struck, there was rarely help from the outside. And within this land of contrasts, mountain and sea, beauty and hardship, stood a rigid structure that defined every life, the class hierarchy. Picture it as a towering ladder, and where you stood on it decided everything. Your food, your clothing, your home, even the length of your life. At the very top of this ladder was the emperor. He was considered divine, a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. And though he rarely ruled directly, his presence symbolized unity. Below him stood the shogun, the military commander who truly held power. The shogun's word was law, his armies vast, and his rule absolute, though always in constant need of defense against rival warlords. Those warlords were called daimyo. They controlled large swaths of land, each ruling their own domain like miniature kingdoms. In their castles, perched high on hills, they commanded armies of samurai and collected taxes from peasants. Their lives might seem luxurious, but they too lived in constant danger. Betrayal by rivals, shifting alliances, and the ceaseless hunger for more land could bring their downfall at any moment. Beneath the daimyo stood the samurai. We often picture them as noble warriors in lacquered armor, carrying shining swords and speaking in hushed tones of honor. And yes, they were respected, bound by the code of Bushido, expected to be loyal, disciplined, and brave. But their lives were not the glamorous stories told in films. Samurai lived under strict discipline, their honor fragile as glass. A single mistake, a single act of cowardice or disobedience could demand the ultimate price: ritual suicide, seppuku, performed with their own blade to restore dignity through death. Next came the peasants, the backbone of society, yet still considered low in status. They toiled in the fields from dawn to dusk, bent over in mud, planting and harvesting rice. Their work sustained everyone above them, and yet they owned little of what they produced. Taxes swallowed much of their harvest, leaving them hungry, tired, and constantly at risk of starvation. They were bound to the land, tied to their villages, and their lives were measured in seasons and storms. Below peasants came the artisans. They were the skilled hands that shaped society's tools, weapons, and art. Blacksmiths forged swords for samurai, carpenters built houses and temples, and potters shaped the clay into vessels both simple and beautiful. They were respected for their skills, but still considered beneath those who grew rice, for in a society so dependent on agriculture, even the artist's touch was seen as secondary. Then came the merchants. In many parts of the world, merchants grew wealthy and powerful, but in feudal Japan, they were looked down upon. Why? Because they did not create, they only traded in the work of others. A merchant might be clever, even rich, but in the eyes of the samurai class he was still lowly, dependent on the labor of farmers and artisans. Ironically, as centuries passed, many merchants did grow wealthy, often surpassing peasants in comfort. Yet their social status remained stubbornly low. And finally, at the very bottom, were the outcasts. Known as burakumin, they were forced into the jobs others would not touch. Handling the dead, tanning hides, working with leather and blood. In a society that prized purity, these tasks were seen as defiling, and those who performed them were marked as unclean, condemned to the margins of villages and the edges of society. Life as an outcast was a life of shame, exclusion, and inherited status. Children born into it rarely escaped. This rigid system was more than just a social map. It was a cage. One could not simply climb the ladder by effort or skill. A peasant could not become a samurai. A merchant could not claim the honor of a daimyo. Where you were born was where you remained, unless war or catastrophe swept away the world around you. And daily survival was tied to this system. If you were a peasant, survival meant enduring hunger and labor. If you were a samurai, survival meant proving your honor again and again, never showing weakness. If you were a merchant, survival meant outsmarting rivals while enduring disdain. And if you were an outcast, survival meant living in the shadows, doing the work that others would rather forget existed. Feudal Japan was breathtaking to behold. Cherry blossoms drifting in spring, harvest festivals lighting up autumn nights, castles rising against the sky. But beneath the poetry and elegance was a life that tested every soul, every day. You were not free to choose your destiny. You were bound by your place in the hierarchy. To live in this world was to learn endurance, obedience, and quiet resilience. And so, as we step further into this journey, remember that the beauty of feudal Japan was never separate from its harshness. The two were woven together, inseparable, like threads in a kimono, delicate on the surface, but strong and unyielding beneath. Now imagine yourself not as a samurai in armor or a lord in a grand castle, but as a peasant, the figure most common in feudal Japan. Your house is small, built of wood and thatch. The floor is hard, sometimes just packed earth. The walls are thin, offering little shelter from winter's cold winds or the heavy rains of summer. When the rooster crows or when the first light of dawn cuts through the mist, you are already awake, because your life, like your father's and his before him, is tied to the soil. Rice farming was the heartbeat of peasant life. From the outside, it might sound simple, planting, watering, harvesting. But in truth, it was endless, back-breaking labor. The rice paddies stretched across the land like mirrors reflecting the sky, but for you, they were fields of mud, sucking at your legs as you bent for hours under the sun. You planted seedlings one by one, row after row, day after day. Your back ached, your hands blistered, and when the summer sun bore down, sweat stung your eyes, mixing with the mud. The irony of rice farming was cruel. Though you grew the very grain that sustained the entire country, much of what you harvested was never yours. Taxes demanded by the daimyo or the samurai collectors could take up to half of your crop, sometimes more. You and your family might labor for months, only to see cart after cart of rice hauled away to fill the storehouses of the lords. What was left for you had to be stretched thin. A bowl of rice padded with vegetables, miso soup, maybe fish if you were lucky. Many nights you went to bed hungry, even though your hands had touched more rice than you could ever count. And then there were the seasons, each bringing its own trials. Spring was for planting, a hopeful time, but always fragile. One bad flood could wash away the seedlings. Summer was the season of toil, long hours in the fields with the sun beating down, mosquitoes biting at your skin. Autumn was the harvest, the most important season of all, but also the most nerve-wracking. A storm at the wrong moment could flatten the stalks, undoing months of work. And winter was cruel. The paddies lay empty and frozen, food stores grew thin, and cold winds cut through your fragile home. Many peasants feared winter more than war, for hunger and frost claimed lives silently. Famine was a shadow that always hovered. 1 year of poor harvest might mean hunger, 2 years could mean catastrophe. Families starved, villages emptied, and some desperate peasants resorted to eating grass, bark, or whatever scraps they could find. And yet taxes rarely relented. Daimyo and samurai demanded their due regardless of the harvest. If you could not pay, your debts grew heavier, and punishment could be severe. For peasants, life was a constant balancing act between endurance and despair. Still, peasants were not without pride. Though they lived at the bottom of the hierarchy, they were not despised like merchants or outcasts. The samurai class respected peasants for one simple reason. They grew rice, the very foundation of wealth and survival. A samurai's sword might glitter, but it was worthless without the farmer's grain to feed him. Entire armies marched on the rice grown by peasants. Entire castles stood because peasants provided the taxes to maintain them. And yet, despite this vital role, peasants remained bound to their villages, unable to climb higher. Their lives were crucial, but their names forgotten. Family life for peasants was centered on survival. Children worked alongside parents from a young age, planting and harvesting, carrying water, tending animals if the family had any. Education was rare, few peasants could read or write. Instead, they passed down oral traditions, songs and folk stories, small sparks of culture that gave life meaning. Festivals marked the seasons, a chance, however brief, to sing, dance, and forget the weight of toil. In these festivals, peasants found moments of joy, a reminder that even in hardship, the human spirit searches for light. But hardship also meant that lives were often short. Disease spread quickly in villages with poor sanitation. Injuries in the fields could turn deadly without proper medicine. Many peasants never saw old age. To live into one's 60s was rare. Many never reached 40. And yet life went on. A child born after a famine, a good harvest after a bad year, a festival after a season of hunger. These small victories kept hope alive. What makes the story of peasants in feudal Japan so striking is this: they carried the weight of the entire system, yet had the least power within it. Every grain of rice that fed a samurai, every tax coin that built a castle, every festival that lit the streets of a town, all of it began with the mud-stained hands of a farmer. Without peasants, the system would have collapsed. And yet peasants themselves remained bound, bent under the demands of those above them, their sacrifices unrecorded. Think of it this way. If you lived as a peasant in feudal Japan, your world would be small but demanding. Your village, your fields, your family, that was your universe. You would rise and sleep with the rhythm of the seasons. You would live with hunger as a familiar companion. You would work not just for yourself, but for everyone above you in the hierarchy. And still, at the end of your life, history would not remember your name. It is here, in the mud and sweat of the rice fields, that we see the true backbone of feudal Japan. Beautiful, yes, but built on the weary shoulders of peasants who endured more than most of us could imagine. When most people hear the word samurai, an image rises almost instantly. A proud warrior in gleaming armor, katana at his side, gazing calmly at the horizon as cherry blossoms fall. It's a picture painted by movies, art, and legend, one of grace, nobility, and strength. But to truly live as a samurai in feudal Japan was not nearly so romantic. It was a life bound by rules tighter than any chain, marked by endless training, harsh discipline, and the constant shadow of death, not just from the battlefield, but from dishonor. Samurai were born into their role. From childhood, the path of the warrior was set. While peasant children learned to plant rice and merchants' children learned to haggle, samurai boys were trained to fight. Wooden swords were pressed into their hands at an early age. Lessons began before dawn, with practice in archery, horseback riding, spear fighting, and of course, the katana, the sword that came to symbolize their entire way of life. Day after day, year after year, they drilled, repeating movements until they became second nature. To hesitate in battle could mean death, so hesitation was trained out of them long before they ever faced a real enemy. But training was not only physical. The samurai's world was built on Bushido, the way of the warrior. This was more than a code of conduct. It was a philosophy that demanded loyalty, honor, self-discipline, and, above all, readiness to sacrifice one's life at any moment. A samurai was expected to place his lord's needs above his own, to obey without question, and to act with dignity in all things. This burden of honor was heavy because honor could be lost in 1,000 ways: cowardice in battle, disobedience to a lord, even small personal failings that stained a family's reputation. To lose honor was worse than death. And in feudal Japan, there was only one way for a disgraced samurai to restore dignity: seppuku, ritual suicide. Imagine the weight of living every day knowing that if you faltered, if you failed, if you even embarrassed your lord, you might be expected to kneel, draw your own short blade, and end your life with your own hands. And yet this expectation was so deeply ingrained that many samurai embraced it. To them, death with honor was better than life with shame. Of course, not every samurai died in ritual suicide. Many fought in battles that swept across Japan during the long centuries of civil war, especially in the Sengoku period, a time when rival daimyo fought endlessly for power. For the samurai, these wars were both opportunity and terror. To distinguish oneself in battle could bring reward, status, even land. But battle was also brutal, and wounds, disease, or simple misfortune could end a life quickly. Samurai armor, made of lacquered plates bound with silk cords, was designed for both protection and mobility, but it was no guarantee. A musket ball, introduced later from European traders, could pierce through it with ease. And when the wars ended, samurai life did not grow easier. During the long Tokugawa peace in the 17th and 18th centuries, many samurai found themselves without battles to fight. Their swords remained sharp, but their purpose dulled. They became administrators, bureaucrats, and guards. Still bound by Bushido, still expected to live with the same discipline, but often poor, as stipends shrank and their lords grew more controlling. The romantic image of a samurai in glorious battle often masked the reality of long years spent in quiet service, managing paperwork, or standing guard in boredom. Daily life for a samurai was filled with rules. What he wore, how he bowed, even how he ate, all were dictated by custom. His two swords, the katana and wakizashi, were his constant companions, symbols of his status and his honor. He could not be careless with them, nor could he flaunt them without purpose. He was trained to walk with a certain bearing, to speak with measured restraint, to live always aware that others were watching, judging, weighing his worthiness. And while samurai men bore the weight of Bushido, samurai women were not free either. Wives of warriors were expected to manage households with quiet strength, to raise sons who would become fighters, and to remain loyal and obedient. In some cases, women were trained to wield the naginata, a long-bladed polearm, to defend their homes in times of danger. But even for them, the strict code of duty and obedience hung heavy. The myth of the samurai paints them as untouchable paragons of honor, but in reality they were human, often conflicted, sometimes cruel. Many samurai, especially in times of peace, became restless, prone to drinking, gambling, or abusing their status. Others became wandering ronin, masterless samurai, dismissed by their lords or orphaned by defeat. Ronin were looked down upon, seen as failures, yet their numbers swelled in the wake of political upheaval. Some turned to crime, others sold their swords to the highest bidder, and a few became legendary figures in their own right, walking a lonely road between honor and survival. To live as a samurai was to live under constant pressure. Yes, there was respect and status. Yes, their word carried weight, and their swords marked them as elite. But behind that respect was a life spent training endlessly, obeying without question, and carrying the burden of honor so fragile that a single misstep could demand death. Imagine carrying that weight every hour of every day. Could you? Could you rise each morning, tie your armor, sharpen your blades, and walk into the world knowing that your own honor was worth more than your life? For most of us today, the answer is no. We might admire the discipline, the grace, the artistry of the samurai, but the reality, the endless training, the harsh code, the constant readiness to die, would break us quickly. The samurai were products of their time, shaped by a society that valued loyalty and obedience above individuality. And in their world, to hesitate, to falter, even to dream of freedom, was to risk everything. The myth will always remain. The noble warrior beneath the cherry blossoms, blade flashing in the sun, but beneath that myth was a reality far harder, far harsher, and far more human. If the peasants carried the system on their backs and the samurai upheld its honor with their swords, then the daimyo were the ones who pulled the strings of power. Picture them as lords of vast domains, rulers of their own miniature kingdoms within Japan, each one commanding armies of samurai, controlling villages and farmland, and dwelling in castles that rose like stone mountains above the land. Their lives might seem glamorous, but to be a daimyo in feudal Japan was to live in a constant game of survival, a game played with politics, betrayals, and the ever-present threat of war. The daimyo's castles stood as symbols of authority. Perched on hills or nestled against rivers, their thick stone walls and high watchtowers dominated the landscape. These were not just homes. They were fortresses designed to withstand sieges and send a clear message: power lives here. Inside, life was a strange mixture of elegance and tension. Tatami mats lined the floors, sliding doors revealed painted screens of landscapes and cranes, and gardens bloomed with carefully tended beauty. Yet beyond those walls, armies drilled restlessly, weapons were sharpened, and scouts carried news of enemy movements. For daimyo, luxury was always shadowed by danger, and danger was everywhere. The Sengoku period, literally the Warring States period, turned Japan into a chessboard of conflict. From the 15th to the 17th century, the country fractured into rival domains, each daimyo fighting for land, power, and survival. Alliances were forged and broken with dizzying speed. Yesterday's ally could be today's enemy. Marriages were arranged not for love, but for political advantage. Trust was rare, and betrayal was common. In this age, daimyo lived with one guiding truth: expand your land or risk losing everything. Land meant rice, rice meant wealth, and wealth meant soldiers. Without soldiers, a daimyo was vulnerable. So castles were fortified, armies drilled, and spies sent to sniff out plots. Some daimyo were skilled strategists, commanding loyalty with brilliance. Others ruled through fear, cruelty, and ruthless ambition. But all of them knew that power was a fragile thing, always at risk of slipping away. Life for a daimyo was a performance of authority. Every word spoken in court, every gesture at a feast, every decision about war or peace, all of it shaped their reputation. A daimyo had to be both warrior and politician, both ruthless and diplomatic. Too soft, and rivals would seize the opportunity to strike. Too cruel, and their own vassals might turn against them. In the Sengoku period especially, betrayal was not an exception, it was an expectation. Imagine waking each day knowing that the men closest to you, the very samurai sworn to your service, might be swayed by an enemy's offer of land or gold. Imagine your family's fate hanging on a marriage alliance that could collapse if a rival's ambition shifted. Imagine sleeping behind castle walls and still wondering if tonight would bring assassins or rebellion. Such was the life of a daimyo. The wars of this era were relentless. Armies clashed on open fields, their banners fluttering in the wind. Samurai charged with spears and swords, arrows darkened the skies, and later the thunder of muskets, newly introduced from Europe, changed the face of battle forever. Villages were burned, rice fields trampled, and countless peasants caught in the crossfire. For daimyo, each battle was both an opportunity and a gamble. Victory could mean rising to dominate rival lords, while defeat could mean not just death, but the destruction of one's entire clan. Some names from this era still echo in history. Oda Nobunaga, the ruthless unifier who crushed rivals with both cunning and cruelty. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant-turned-general who rose to rule almost all of Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient strategist who built a dynasty that lasted for centuries. But for every famous name, there were dozens of daimyo whose castles fell, whose families were erased, whose dreams of power ended in ashes. Even in times of uneasy peace, the life of a daimyo was tightly controlled. When the Tokugawa shogunate finally brought stability in the 17th century, daimyo were forced into submission under a strict system called sankin kotai, the alternate attendance policy. They had to spend part of each year in the shogun's capital, Edo, while their families were kept there almost permanently as hostages to ensure loyalty. This meant long journeys along the highways of Japan, grand processions of retainers and banners designed to display both wealth and obedience. Daimyo might return to their domains to rule, but always under the watchful eye of the shogun, their independence an illusion. And so, whether in the chaos of Sengoku or the enforced peace of Tokugawa rule, the daimyo lived under constant strain. To rule was to fear betrayal, to fight was to risk destruction, and even in peace, to serve another lord meant bending one's ambition to survive. If you imagine stepping into the life of a daimyo, it may seem tempting at first. A castle to call your own, armies at your command, the respect of peasants and samurai alike. But with that came endless pressure. Every decision could decide the fate of thousands. Every gesture could spark suspicion. Every alliance was a rope stretched thin over an abyss. Wealth and power glittered, yes, but behind the glitter was an unrelenting game of survival where one wrong move could erase your legacy forever. For the peasants, life was toil. For the samurai, life was honor. But for the daimyo, life was power, and the constant fear of losing it. When we think of feudal Japan, the images that rise to mind are often of warriors, castles, and battles. But behind every samurai, every daimyo, and every village stood women whose lives were bound by duty, expectation, and sacrifice. Their stories are quieter, but no less important. And to live as a woman in this time was to exist within a cage of rules, responsibilities, and often harsh realities. A womaness life in feudal Japan was shaped almost entirely by the class into which she was born, but across all classes one theme echoed. Duty to family came before self. For peasant women, life meant labor. They rose early working in the rice fields alongside men, planting, harvesting, and carrying heavy loads. When not in the fields, they cared for children, prepared meals, spun thread, and maintained the household. Work never truly ended. Even during pregnancy, many peasant women continued to labor, often returning to the fields just days after giving birth. Their contribution was essential yet largely invisible. For women of the samurai class, life was different in appearance, but not necessarily easier. A samurai wife was expected to manage the household with discipline and efficiency. While her husband served his lord or fought on the battlefield, she oversaw finances, cared for servants, raised children, and ensured the family's honor remained untarnished. A woman's behavior reflected directly on her husband's reputation, and so the pressure to act with restraint, obedience, and dignity was immense. Some samurai women were trained to fight, wielding the naginata, a long-bladed polearm, to defend their homes if attacked. These women, known as honor bugeisha, were not common, but they existed, and their stories still resonate. Imagine a woman standing at the gates of her home, weapon in hand, ready to defend her children against invaders. They were not celebrated like male samurai, but their courage was no less real. Still, for most, the role was not to fight on the battlefield, but to hold the family together in the shadows of war. Marriage for women was rarely a matter of love. In nearly every class, marriages were arranged, often when the bride and groom were still very young. Among the samurai and daimyo, these marriages were political tools, binding families together through alliances. A girl might be promised to a man she had never met, her value measured in the strength her family's name could add to her husband's clan. Among peasants, marriages were practical, a joining of labor and survival. But in nearly every case, choice was not hers to make. And once married, a woman's life became one of service to her husband, her children, and her in-laws. Divorce was rare, though technically possible, and often carried deep shame for women. Widows, too, carried burdens, sometimes forced to remarry quickly to maintain family alliances, or in harsher cases, expected to follow their husbands in death, a practice known as yunshi, though it was eventually outlawed. For women in merchant or artisan families, there were small cracks in the rigid system. Some merchant women managed shops, handled accounts, and played crucial roles in family businesses. In cities like Kyoto and Edo, women sometimes found ways to earn livelihoods outside the strict domestic sphere. But even here, freedom was limited. Women were always expected to remain secondary to men, their lives defined by obedience. At the very bottom of society, women of outcast communities carried even heavier burdens. They were tied to the same unclean work as their families, handling the dead, working with leather, or cleaning waste. Their marriages were restricted, their movements monitored, and their lives marked by shame not of their own making. A woman born into such a family had little hope of escaping her fate, no matter how hard she worked or how much she endured. And yet, within these restrictions, women found ways to endure and sometimes even to influence. Mothers taught children the values of their class. Samurai wives often advised their husbands behind closed doors, shaping decisions indirectly. Peasant women passed down songs, rituals, and customs that preserved culture through the generations. Their power was rarely acknowledged openly, but it existed, subtle, quiet, and essential. The harshest truth of being a woman in feudal Japan was this: rights were few, expectations many. A woman could not inherit land like a man. Her choices in marriage, education, or work were limited, often non-existent. Her reputation was fragile, tied not only to her own behavior, but to the actions of her family. To step outside these boundaries was to invite judgment, shame, and sometimes ruin. If you imagine yourself in their sandals, you might feel the weight of obedience pressing down. Imagine being told from childhood that your worth lies not in your dreams, but in your duty. Imagine watching brothers or sons trained to fight, to rise in status, while you are trained to bow, to endure, to sacrifice. And yet imagine also the quiet strength it would take to keep families alive during famine, to manage households in times of war, to raise children with resilience in a world that gave little kindness. For every samurai who drew his sword, there was a woman who kept his household standing. For every peasant who bent over the rice fields, there was a woman beside him, planting and harvesting. For every daimyo who schemed for power, there was a daughter or wife married off to secure his alliances. The history of feudal Japan is filled with warriors and rulers, but beneath it runs the story of women whose lives were harder than most, whose sacrifices allowed the system to endure. To be a woman in feudal Japan was to live with strength hidden beneath obedience, resilience disguised as duty. It was not a life of glory, but it was a life that held families, villages, and even empires together. Picture a meal in feudal Japan. Forget for a moment the lavish sushi platters or steaming bowls of ramen we know today. Those are modern luxuries. For the majority of people back then, food was not about variety or indulgence. It was about survival, and survival often meant little more than a bowl of rice, a few pickled vegetables, and, if fortune smiled on you, a small scrap of fish. Rice was everything. It was not just food, but currency, wealth, and power. Daimyo measured their domains not by acres or population, but by koku, a unit that represented how much rice could feed one person for a year. Samurai were often paid in rice stipends. Taxes were collected in rice, leaving peasants with little of their harvest to eat themselves. Imagine bending over flooded fields day after day, growing rice that you could not even keep, knowing most of it would leave your home to fill the storehouses of your lord. For peasants, daily meals were simple. Polished white rice was a luxury. Most ate millet or barley mixed with rice to stretch it further. Vegetables like radishes, greens, and beans were common, often pickled to last through the seasons. Soybeans were invaluable, giving rise to miso paste and tofu, both staples of the diet. Fish was eaten when available, especially in coastal areas, but meat was rare. Buddhist influence discouraged eating animals, and for most people, livestock were too valuable alive to be slaughtered for food. Chickens meant eggs, cows and oxen meant labor, so meat remained out of reach for all but the wealthy. And yet food was more than just nourishment, it was a marker of class. Samurai dined on finer meals, sometimes including fish, sake, and more refined rice. The daimyo and elite could afford banquets with elaborate dishes designed not just to satisfy hunger, but to display wealth and sophistication. Meanwhile, peasants were bound by strict laws that dictated what they could and could not consume. In some regions, eating certain foods was forbidden for lower classes, ensuring that luxury remained the privilege of the few. Even in sustenance, hierarchy was enforced. The struggle, however, was not only about limited variety, it was about survival through the harsh realities of famine. Japan's geography, mountainous with limited farmland, meant food supplies were always precarious. Floods could wash away entire rice fields in a single season. Droughts could turn paddies to cracked earth. Harsh winters, especially in northern regions, brought hunger that gnawed at entire villages. And when harvests failed, famine followed like a shadow. Famine was more than just an empty stomach. It was mothers watching children waste away. It was desperate families boiling bark, roots, and even straw to quiet hunger pains. There are accounts of villages so devastated by famine that entire populations dwindled, with fields left untended because the farmers themselves had starved. In such times, the rigid class system only deepened suffering. Peasants still owed taxes, even when there was no rice to harvest. To default on taxes was to risk punishment, imprisonment, or worse. And so many families starved quietly, giving up their grain to their lords while scraping by on whatever scraps they could find. Imagine the sound of famine in a village, the silence of empty granaries, the absence of laughter in the streets, the thin cries of children at night. Hunger was not rare. It was a recurring terror that haunted every generation. For those higher up the ladder, food was a symbol of control. The daimyo's granaries were guarded carefully, stockpiled to ensure their armies never went hungry. In times of scarcity, some lords opened their stores to feed peasants, gaining loyalty. Others hoarded supplies, letting their people suffer while ensuring their own power remained unshaken. Food, in this way, was a weapon as much as a resource. Daily eating habits also reflected discipline and modesty. Meals were taken sitting on tatami mats, food served in small wooden or lacquer bowls. There was little excess, no sprawling feast for common folk. Instead, meals were quiet, simple, and functional. To waste food was unthinkable. Every grain of rice mattered, every bite carried the weight of survival. And yet, despite the hardships, there were moments of joy connected to food. Festivals often brought rare treats, special rice cakes, sweetened with a little honey or fruit. New Year celebrations might see families share mochi, pounded rice cakes that symbolized good fortune and resilience. These moments were precious, a break from the grind of scarcity, a reminder that even in the hardest times, people sought comfort in shared meals and traditions. If you were to step into the life of a peasant family, you would feel this reality deeply. The anticipation of planting season, the exhaustion of harvest, the anxiety of storing enough food to last through winter. It all revolved around the fragile thread of survival. A single bad season could undo years of work. A single storm could tip the balance from subsistence to starvation. To live in feudal Japan was to know hunger as a constant possibility. For the lower classes, full stomachs were rare, and indulgence was nearly impossible. Even for the samurai and daimyo, food carried weight beyond taste. It was tied to duty, wealth, and politics. And so, meals were not just meals. They were reflections of status, echoes of hardship, and reminders that in a land of beauty and tradition, survival was always uncertain. A bowl of rice was never just a bowl of rice, it was life itself. Fought for, taxed, rationed, and cherished. If rice, labor, and famine defined daily survival in feudal Japan, disease and poor health were ever-present shadows. Life was fragile and the body was constantly under threat. Medicine existed, but it was primitive by modern standards, often interwoven with superstition, and frequently powerless against the illnesses that swept through villages, towns, and even castles. Imagine a village where every cough or fever could spark fear. Epidemics were common, and no class was entirely immune. Smallpox, dysentery, tuberculosis. These diseases could travel quickly through cramped homes, markets, or armies on the move. Healing remedies were often a mixture of herbal knowledge, rituals, and superstition. Plants, roots, and powders were applied with varying degrees of effectiveness, while charms and prayers were relied upon in equal measure. A mother might rub a sick child with certain leaves while chanting prayers, hoping that the spirits would spare them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and there was no way to know which. Hospitals as we know them today did not exist. The closest approximation were small clinics in towns, sometimes attached to temples, where monks or local healers offered care. Treatments could be curious and frightening: acupuncture, moxibustion, burning herbs near the skin, and other practices aimed at restoring balance to the body. Surgery was rare, painful, and often fatal. Many remedies were more symbolic than effective. The uncertainty was exhausting. No one truly knew which illnesses would pass on their own, which could be cured, and which would take a life. Hygiene was another paradox of the era. On the one hand, Japan had a deep cultural tradition of bathing, tied to purification rituals in Shinto and Buddhist practices. Communal baths existed, and even peasants sought to wash themselves regularly, especially after work in the fields. Rivers, streams, and hot springs were used for cleansing, and cleanliness was linked to both spiritual and social well-being. On the other hand, the understanding of germs, infection, and disease transmission was non-existent. Clothes were seldom washed thoroughly, latrines were rudimentary, and contamination was frequent. Even the simplest scratch could turn dangerous if infection set in, often unnoticed, until it was too late. Children were particularly vulnerable. Malnutrition, common among peasants, made them susceptible to illness. Vaccination, antibiotics, or proper sanitation were unknown. Epidemics could wipe out entire villages or claim large portions of a city's population. Parents lived with constant worry, unable to shield their families from invisible threats. Even among the elite, disease could strike with little warning. Samurai or daimyo might have access to better diets and care, but an epidemic could still sweep through their ranks, leaving no one safe. Life expectancy in feudal Japan reflected these dangers. For peasants, short lives were the norm. Many did not survive past their 30s or 40s. Samurai often fared slightly better due to better nutrition, lower exposure to famine, and access to rudimentary care, but death from illness, wounds, or seppuku was always near. Only the wealthiest daimyo had the means to survive longer, though even they were not immune to sudden outbreaks of disease. Childbirth was another perilous time. For women, pregnancy and delivery were fraught with danger. Complications that modern medicine could easily manage often proved fatal. Infant mortality was high, and women lived with the constant fear of losing a child or their own life. Many families prayed and performed rituals to protect both mother and child, but the results were uncertain. Life was, in many ways, a fragile thread stretching across uncertain days. Despite these dangers, people adapted. Villages developed informal health practices. Herbal remedies were passed down through generations. Certain foods were considered protective against illness. Community members helped each other care for the sick. The Japanese also held strong beliefs in purification, balance, and harmony between the body and the natural world, practices that sometimes brought comfort, if not true protection. Death was a frequent companion. A fever could strike, a wound could fester, or famine could arrive unexpectedly. Funerals and memorial rituals were deeply embedded in culture, offering families a way to honor the dead and cope with loss. In a society where survival was never guaranteed, accepting mortality was part of daily life. Stepping into this world, it is clear how demanding life was. You could toil from dawn to dusk in the fields, eat what little was available, and still be felled by forces beyond your control. The human body, fragile and vulnerable, had to endure backbreaking labor, meager nutrition, exposure to the elements, and the constant threat of disease. Even in the most beautiful landscapes where cherry blossoms bloomed and mountains stretched endlessly, death was close at hand, and so the people of feudal Japan developed resilience. They learned to value every day, every meal, every warm fire in winter. They relied on each other in sickness and health, passed down knowledge through generations, and found moments of ritual prayer and celebration that gave their lives meaning despite the fragility of the body. For anyone today imagining themselves in that time, it becomes clear you would need more than courage to survive. You would need endurance, luck, and a deep understanding that life itself was a constant balancing act between the seen and unseen, between effort and fate. In feudal Japan, the law was not a gentle hand guiding behavior, but a firm, often brutal instrument of control. Justice was designed not only to punish wrongdoing, but to maintain the strict social hierarchy that governed every life. For peasants, samurai, and even women, the consequences of missteps could be severe. And for the marginalized, justice was often merciless. Imagine a village where every act, large or small, is under scrutiny. Theft, disobedience, or disrespect could draw attention from local officials or samurai enforcers. For a peasant, stealing even a few grains of rice could mean flogging, fines, or forced labor. Punishments were designed to be public, a clear message to others about the price of breaking the rules. The aim was not rehabilitation, but deterrence, a vivid reminder that the social order must remain unbroken. The methods of punishment could be harsh, flogging with bamboo rods, being forced to kneel in the sun for hours, or even mutilation for repeated offences were common. Execution, too, was used as both punishment and spectacle. Beheading was the most common form of capital punishment, often performed in public to impress upon witnesses the cost of crime. Crucifixion, burning, or drowning was sometimes employed for particularly serious offences. Even the samurai, bound by bushido, could face death for crimes against their lord, and dishonour often demanded ritual suicide or seppuku, rather than waiting for the executioner's blade. And then there were the outcasts, the burakumin, who occupied the very bottom of the social ladder. Born into families tasked with unclean work, handling the dead, tanning hides, or disposing of waste, these individuals were already marked as outsiders. Society's laws were particularly unforgiving toward them. Minor offences could result in severe punishment, and their status meant there was little room for mercy. They were treated as criminals even in daily life, marginalized in villages, denied access to education or marriage outside their caste, and forced to live at the edges of towns. Criminals, too, were often visible and feared. Bandits roamed rural areas, preying on travelers and isolated villages. Samurai patrols and local militias were tasked with maintaining order, and when these criminals were caught, punishments were swift and brutal. The justice system relied heavily on public shaming and fear. Executions were often staged in market squares or crossroads, where the condemned would be paraded before the crowd before the final sentence was carried out. The spectacle served as a warning: break the law and you will pay painfully and publicly. Punishments were not always evenly applied. Status mattered enormously. A samurai could commit a crime but often receive more lenient treatment due to family connections or social standing. A peasant caught committing the same act would face full force of the law. This inequality reinforced the rigid hierarchy, reminding everyone that where you stood in society determined not only what you could do but also how the law would treat you. Certain crimes were considered particularly heinous, such as betrayal of a lord or treason. Samurai accused of dishonoring their clan might be required to perform seppuku, turning justice into a personal, ritualized act. Even those outside the warrior class could face death for offenses against authority or property, especially if the crime threatened the social fabric. Feudal Japan's legal system existed less to explore fairness or rehabilitation and more to enforce control, maintain order, and uphold a society in which every class knew its place. But punishment was not only about lawbreakers. Social norms themselves carried implicit consequences. A woman who stepped outside her expected role, a peasant who questioned a tax collector, or even a merchant who flaunted wealth in a disrespectful way risked retribution. In a world where status was sacred and the hierarchy unyielding, discipline extended beyond the courtroom into daily life, shaping behavior with both fear and expectation. Execution methods were designed to be memorable. Beheadings, for instance, were not just functional, they were demonstrations of power. A samurai might carry out the act with skill, showing respect for ritual, while peasants could be subjected to crude and painful methods that lingered in memory. Hanging, crucifixion, and drowning were used sparingly, but left an impression of absolute authority. Public punishments were both cautionary tales and reinforcement of the social hierarchy. For the outcasts and those already marginalized, survival required extreme caution. The Burakumin lived with constant vigilance, knowing that any misstep could trigger harsh retaliation. Their work was essential to society, but socially reviled. The law could and did turn against them easily, compounding the hardships they faced in everyday life. Even in smaller infractions, the psychological weight of justice loomed large. Peasants and townsfolk were aware of what could happen if they broke rules or failed in duty. This fear became part of daily life, reinforcing obedience and conformity. Public floggings or executions were reminders that every action mattered and that the balance of survival required navigating both labor and law carefully. In a way, feudal Japan's justice system was an extension of the society it governed. Hierarchy, obedience, and social order dictated not just who lived and died, but how daily life unfolded. Rules were strict, punishments often brutal, and mercy rare. Life was not a matter of fairness, but of endurance. To navigate it successfully, one needed caution, discretion, and an understanding of the delicate web connecting labor, loyalty, and law. To step into this world is to realize that crime and punishment were never abstract ideas. They were part of the rhythm of life, shaping villages, families, and even castles. You would carry the fear of law alongside the fear of famine, disease, and dishonor, always aware that one wrong step could tip the balance from survival into tragedy. To truly understand life in feudal Japan, it is not enough to look at swords, rice fields, or castles. One must also look to the unseen forces that shaped people's hearts, minds, and daily lives: religion, spirituality, and ritual. For the people of this era, belief was woven into every action, every season, and every milestone, a quiet undercurrent giving meaning to a life often harsh and unpredictable. At the core of Japanese spirituality was Shinto, the indigenous belief system that honored kami, spirits or deities that inhabit natural objects, places, and forces. Rivers, mountains, trees, and even rocks could hold these spirits. People respected and revered them, offering prayers, food, or simple acts of gratitude to maintain harmony. A peasant planting rice might pause to offer a prayer to the kami of the field, seeking protection from storms or pests. A samurai crossing a river might bow to the spirits of the water, acknowledging forces beyond his control. In Shinto, the natural world was alive and sacred, a constant presence shaping decisions and actions. Buddhism, introduced centuries earlier from China and Korea, added a deeper layer of spiritual reflection. Temples dotted the countryside, from sprawling complexes near cities to small shrines along mountain paths. Buddhism offered guidance on suffering, mortality, and the impermanence of life. For a peasant who had witnessed famine, disease, and hardship, Buddhist teachings provided comfort. Life is fleeting, suffering is universal, and detachment from worldly attachments could bring peace. Even samurai found solace in Zen Buddhism, which emphasized meditation, mindfulness, and the cultivation of a calm, focused mind. A warrior might meditate before battle, seeking clarity, composure, and the ability to accept death without fear. Zen, in particular, left a mark on daily life. Its principles extended beyond meditation into art, gardening, tea ceremonies, and swordsmanship. The practice of mindfulness helped samurai maintain discipline, helped artisans perfect their craft, and helped peasants navigate the rhythm of planting and harvesting. Even in small moments, arranging stones in a garden, folding a piece of cloth, pouring tea, Zen philosophy encouraged attention to detail, calmness, and harmony. Spirituality was not a distant abstraction, it was lived, woven into the texture of everyday life. Rituals, too, were everywhere. Shinto and Buddhist practices often overlapped, and festivals marked the changing seasons, births, marriages, deaths, and harvests. Purification rituals were common, designed to cleanse the body, home, or community of impurity or misfortune. Peasants might wash hands at a river or sprinkle salt at the entrance to their homes. Samurai performed similar rituals before battle, purifying themselves to face violence with clarity and honor. Even daimyo participated in grand ceremonies that combined politics, spirituality, and spectacle, linking their rule to divine favor. Life and death were closely tied to ritual. Funerals followed prescribed forms, whether simple village ceremonies or elaborate samurai rites. Offerings were made to the deceased, prayers recited, and grave sites tended carefully. Ancestors were honored regularly, and it was believed that neglecting these duties could bring misfortune. Spirituality in feudal Japan was not passive. It was active, practical, and intimately connected to the well-being of family, community, and self. Superstition played a role alongside formal religion. Certain days were considered lucky or unlucky. Specific directions or colors could influence outcomes, and objects were believed to carry protective power. Peasants might hang talismans to ward off disease or misfortune, while samurai might choose auspicious days to fight or travel. Even the simplest actions, crossing a bridge, entering a forest, beginning a harvest, were influenced by the invisible presence of spirits, fate, and the cycles of nature. The beauty of these spiritual practices lies in their integration into daily life. They were not isolated to grand temples or religious elites. A farmer's prayer before planting, a merchant's offering at a shrine before opening a shop, a child's respect for ancestors. All these moments reflected a worldview in which human life existed in a delicate balance with forces larger than oneself. Life in feudal Japan was unpredictable and often harsh, but spirituality offered guidance, comfort, and a sense of order amid chaos. Even the samurai's strict code of Bushido was shaped by spiritual influence. Zen meditation, ritual purification, and reflection on mortality helped warriors face death with composure. Honor, loyalty, and discipline were not only social expectations but also spiritual practices, a way to align oneself with a higher order and achieve inner peace even in the midst of violence. For women, spirituality provided both duty and solace. Participation in seasonal festivals, temple visits, and household rituals allowed them to connect with the unseen world, maintain family honor, and find small moments of agency in otherwise constrained lives. Even peasants, burdened by famine and labor, found comfort in prayers, charms, and community festivals. Moments that reminded them that life, while hard, was also sacred, and meaningful. Stepping into feudal Japan, it becomes clear that religion and spirituality were not mere belief systems. They were a lens through which every hardship, every joy, every ritual of survival was understood. Life was structured by labor, duty, and hierarchy, yes, but it was also shaped by respect for nature, reverence for ancestors, and acknowledgement of forces beyond human control. Spirituality allowed people to navigate a world of uncertainty with ritual, reflection, and an enduring sense of connection to family, community, and the cosmos itself. To live in feudal Japan was to exist simultaneously in the tangible and the unseen. Every planting, every harvest, every battle, every illness was observed not only by human eyes, but by the watchful presence of kami, spirits, and ancestors. The land was alive, the seasons sacred, and life, with all its hardships, deeply interwoven with the spiritual. As we wander further into the life and struggles of feudal Japan, another thread emerges, one woven not into the fields or the castles, but into the very borders of the land itself. Japan was not only shaped by its mountains, seas, and social classes, but also by its relationship with the outside world. For long stretches of its history, Japan lived in deliberate isolation, wary of what foreign contact might bring. The term most often used to describe this period is sakoku, meaning closed country. From the early 1600s until the mid-1800s, Japan maintained a rigid policy of limiting foreign influence. This was not simply a matter of pride or preference, it was born of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of social upheaval, and fear that foreign religions, technologies, and ambitions could disrupt the fragile order so carefully constructed by the Tokugawa shogunate. At first glance, the idea of closing an entire nation might seem extreme, almost impossible. But in feudal Japan, isolation was enforced with absolute seriousness. Travel abroad was forbidden. Japanese citizens caught leaving the islands were not welcome back but punished with death. Foreigners who attempted to enter Japan illegally were met with the same fate. The seas, already dangerous, became more than natural barriers, they became walls. Yet the decision to close Japan did not happen in a vacuum. The 16th century had brought an influx of traders, missionaries, and adventurers from Europe, particularly the Portuguese, Dutch, and Spanish. With them came not only goods such as firearms, tobacco, and new foods, but also Christian missionaries intent on spreading their faith. For a while, the novelty of these outsiders fascinated daimyo and merchants alike. Firearms changed the face of warfare, new crops supplemented diets, and the foreign presence offered glimpses of a wider world. But beneath this curiosity lurked unease. Christianity, in particular, spread quickly, gaining thousands of converts, including some powerful lords. To the Tokugawa shogunate, this was no harmless faith. It was a threat to unity and control. And so the policy of sakoku was born. Ports were closed, missionaries were expelled or executed, Christianity was banned, and those who continued to practice it in secret faced brutal persecution. Families who harbored crosses, images of Christ, or even whispered prayers risked torture and death. Entire villages were sometimes forced to step on Christian icons to prove loyalty to the shogunate. Religion, which we saw as a source of comfort and order in daily life, became, in this case, a dangerous liability if it came from beyond Japan's shores. The fear of foreign corruption extended beyond religion. The Tokugawa leaders worried that trade and contact with Europeans could destabilize their carefully balanced hierarchy. They feared ambitious daimyo might use foreign firearms or alliances to challenge their authority. They feared peasants might be inspired to rebel by promises of a different kind of faith or a different kind of freedom. Isolation became the solution, a wall of silence enforced with punishment, designed to preserve tradition and stability. Still, Sakoku was not absolute in the way the name suggests. A few narrow channels of contact remained open. The Dutch were allowed a small trading post on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay. The Chinese maintained limited trade, as did the Koreans, through controlled embassies. These rare exchanges trickled foreign knowledge into Japan: astronomy, medicine, cartography, and technology, but always under the watchful eye of the shogunate. For most Japanese people, however, foreigners were distant rumors, strange figures spoken of in hushed tones, their lands unreachable and forbidden. Imagine being a peasant during this time. Your entire world is bounded by your village, the rice fields, and perhaps the market town a day's walk away. The sea, glittering on the horizon, is both beautiful and dangerous. You hear stories of ships with tall masts, of men with pale faces or strange clothes, of religions that speak of a single god instead of many spirits. But such tales are half myth, half warning. To speak too openly of them could invite suspicion, and suspicion, in feudal Japan, could be deadly. For samurai, isolation also had meaning. It preserved the code of Bushido and the structure of service without the disruptive influence of foreign weapons or ideas. Firearms, introduced by the Portuguese, had already begun to change the nature of combat, reducing the need for swords and archery. But under the Tokugawa shogunate, restrictions on guns slowed their spread. The sword, once more, became the symbol of samurai identity, a deliberate choice to preserve tradition over foreign innovation. Isolation was not only about politics, it was about identity, about holding on to what it meant to be Japanese in a rapidly shifting world. And yet, for all the walls, cracks remained. There are rare and fascinating stories of outsiders who managed to make it in, men like William Adams, an English navigator who became a trusted advisor to Tokugawa Ieyasu himself in the early 1600s. Adams learned Japanese, adopted their customs, and even became a samurai. A foreigner accepted, though exceptional. Such cases were extraordinary anomalies in a world otherwise closed tight. For the vast majority, Japan remained an impenetrable mystery, as distant as the moon. This isolation, harsh as it was, preserved Japan's stability for more than 2 centuries. While Europe convulsed with wars, revolutions, and colonial expansions, Japan remained comparatively steady, its rhythms of rice planting, castle politics, and ritual unchanged. But the cost was high. Innovation slowed, global knowledge was missed, and when the walls finally cracked open in the 19th century with the arrival of Western powers, Japan was forced into a sudden, jarring transformation. For the people who lived within Sakoku, however, the isolation was not abstract. It was lived reality. It meant no chance of escape if your life was harsh. It meant rumors instead of encounters. It meant the fear that even speaking of foreign gods or foreign places might mark you as disloyal. To live in feudal Japan was to live in a closed world, surrounded by seas that did not only separate, but protected and imprisoned at the same time. So when we think of feudal Japan, it is not just the rice fields, the castles, or the swords we must remember. It is also the silence at the edges of the map, the deliberate choice to remain apart, to lock the doors of a nation and guard them with unwavering vigilance. Life inside those walls was rich with culture, beauty, and ritual, but it was also confined, restricted, and deeply suspicious of what lay beyond the horizon. For all its rigid hierarchies, daily struggles, and unforgiving codes of honor, life in feudal Japan was not entirely a story of hardship. People, no matter their class, sought ways to laugh, to breathe, and to briefly step outside the weight of duty. In a world dominated by rice fields, wars, and rituals, there were moments, fleeting, sometimes forbidden, sometimes celebrated, of entertainment and escapism. These diversions, though unevenly distributed, offered a glimpse of joy, art, and the fragile beauty of being alive. One of the most vivid forms of entertainment was kabuki theater. Born in the early 17th century, kabuki was unlike anything else. It was colorful, dramatic, exaggerated, a vibrant contrast to the restrained etiquette of samurai courts or the exhausting labor of peasant life. Kabuki actors wore elaborate costumes, painted their faces with bold colors, and moved with exaggerated gestures that could be read even from the back of a crowded theater. Stories ranged from epic tales of samurai heroism to scandalous romances, from historical dramas to comedic sketches. For the common people, kabuki was a revelation. It was not the refined, reserved performance of court musicians or elite no plays. Kabuki was wild, energetic, accessible. Merchants, artisans, and townsfolk packed into theaters, shouting the names of their favorite actors, buying woodblock prints of stars, and gossiping about performances. For a few hours, the struggles of taxes, famine, and social rank faded away in the glow of stage lanterns. Yet kabuki was not without controversy. Authorities often tried to censor performances, worried they spread dangerous ideas or encouraged frivolity. Still it endured, a sign that even in tightly controlled Japan, the human need for story and spectacle could not be suppressed. Then there was the more intimate escape of poetry. Haiku, with its compressed beauty of 17 syllables, flourished during this time. Poets like Matsuo Basho wandered the countryside, composing verses that captured the fleeting beauty of a frog jumping into a pond, or the melancholy of autumn leaves falling. Poetry was not reserved for elites alone. It was accessible, portable, something even a farmer might attempt after a long day, sitting beneath the stars. The practice of poetry allowed people to make sense of their world, to notice, to reflect, to give voice to both sorrow and joy. Alongside poetry was the tea ceremony, or shanoyu. At first glance it might seem a simple act, the preparation and sharing of tea. But in reality it was a carefully choreographed ritual, steeped in Zen philosophy, emphasizing mindfulness, harmony, and respect. For samurai, the tea ceremony was both a refined art and a form of spiritual discipline, a moment of stillness amid lives governed by violence and duty. For merchants and artisans who could afford participation, it became a sign of culture and refinement. The carefully chosen tea bowl, the deliberate movements, the silence punctuated by the soft sound of water, all these created an oasis of peace in a turbulent world. More boisterous than poetry or tea was the world of sumo wrestling. Its roots stretched deep into Japan's past, tied to Shinto rituals for harvest and fertility, but in the feudal era, sumo grew into a popular form of entertainment. Matches drew crowds of all classes, eager to watch massive wrestlers clash in bouts of raw strength and ritualized movement. The dohyo, or ring, was sacred ground, sprinkled with salt for purification, while the wrestlers themselves were treated with both reverence and awe. For peasants, artisans, and townsfolk, a sumo match was more than sport. It was a spectacle that bound communities together, a shared moment of excitement and pride. Yet it must be remembered, these escapes were unevenly distributed. A peasant bound to the land, struggling to survive famine or disease, might rarely see kabuki or a sumo match. Their escapism came in simpler forms: seasonal festivals with drums and dancing, storytelling around a fire, songs sung at planting or harvest. These moments, while humble, were no less important. In fact, they may have been the truest form of relief. Laughter and song shared within a small community, a reminder that even under crushing weight, joy could flicker. For the merchant class, however, entertainment blossomed more fully. Wealthy merchants, though looked down upon socially, often became patrons of kabuki, poetry circles, and tea ceremonies. They commissioned art, collected prints, and hosted gatherings. For them, entertainment was not only pleasure, but a way to assert cultural influence in a society that denied them political power. The samurai, bound by Bushido, had a more complicated relationship with escapism. To indulge too openly in entertainment risked dishonor, yet many found solace in poetry, in the meditative discipline of tea, or in discreet visits to theaters and pleasure districts. Even daimyo, those warlords perched at the top of the ladder, supported entertainers, commissioned performances, and filled their castles with art. Escapism, after all, was not only for the powerless. Even the powerful needed relief from the constant threat of betrayal, war, and responsibility. These escapes reveal something deeply human about feudal Japan. Beneath the rigid codes and harsh realities, there was always a yearning for beauty, joy, and release. The plays, poems, ceremonies, and matches were not frivolities. They were lifelines. They reminded people that life, though fleeting and often cruel, also contained laughter, artistry, and awe. To step into a kabuki theater, to sip tea in silence, to watch a sumo wrestler clash, or to whisper a haiku under the moon, these were acts of rebellion against despair. They were ways of saying, yes, life is hard, but it is also more than hardship. And in that sense, escapism in feudal Japan was not mere distraction, it was survival. And now, as we come to the end of our long journey through feudal Japan, let us step back and look at the picture whole. By now, the patterns are clear. The rice fields, the castles, the shrines, the theatres, the swords, all of them formed part of a world at once beautiful and brutal. To visit it in a dream may be enchanting. To live in it, even for a single day, would be something else entirely. It is easy, in the modern world, to romanticize the past. We picture the gleaming armor of a samurai, the elegance of a tea ceremony, the blossoming of cherry trees against the backdrop of tiled castle roofs. We imagine wandering through lantern-lit streets, hearing the distant sound of a shamisen, watching kabuki actors stride across the stage. There is a certain poetry in these images, and they are not false. But they are only part of the truth. The other part is less forgiving. Let us imagine, just for a moment, that you wake one morning in feudal Japan. Perhaps you are a peasant, the most likely role. The air is heavy with the heat of summer. You rise before dawn, stomach already hollow, and step barefoot into muddy fields. Your task is endless, planting, weeding, harvesting rice. The work breaks your back, and still most of the harvest will be taken in taxes. Tonight, there may be only thin gruel for you and your children. Tomorrow, perhaps nothing at all if the rains come late or too heavy. Or perhaps you are born into the warrior class, a samurai. The romantic image is one of honor and power, but reality demands discipline without rest. Every movement of your body, every thought in your mind must conform to the code of Bushido. A careless word, a moment of cowardice, a failed duty, any could bring dishonor. And dishonor was not a stain to be hidden. It was a sentence, often answered by seppuku. Ritual suicide. Imagine living each day with that shadow at your back, knowing that your life was not truly your own, but held in the hands of your Lord, your family's honor, and your society's expectations. If you were a woman, the burdens changed, but did not lighten. Marriage was rarely a matter of choice, but of arrangement. Your role was to serve husband and family, to raise children, and to preserve honor through obedience. Some women found ways to carve meaning, through temple life, poetry, or even the path of onobugeisha, the female warrior. But for most, freedom was a distant dream. Even joy was tightly bound to duty. And across every class ran the same thread: danger. Disease lurked without cure. A cough, a wound, or a fever could end a life quickly, and often did. Famines struck with cruel regularity. reducing entire villages to hunger. Crime, when punished, was met with cruelty. Executions in public squares, brutal displays meant to remind everyone of the cost of disobedience. The very land that gave beauty, mountains, rivers, forests, also gave disaster, floods, earthquakes, typhoons. Survival was never guaranteed, not even for the strong. On top of this, the social rules were relentless. The ladder of feudal Japan was steep and unforgiving. Emperor, shogun, daimyo, samurai, peasant, artisan, merchant, outcast. Where you were born, you stayed. There was little chance to climb higher, no path to wealth or freedom if you began at the bottom. To step outside your station, to dress above your class, to speak too boldly, was to invite punishment. Life was scripted, and the role was assigned before you even drew your first breath. So when we say, "you wouldn't last a day," it is not mockery. It is a recognition of how soft modern life has made us. We are not used to the feel of hunger gnawing every night, or the sting of cold without warmth. We are not trained to endure endless labor in the heat, nor to live each moment beneath the weight of unyielding duty. We are not bound by codes so strict that a slip of the tongue could mean death. We are not forced to worship the spirits of rice and river in hopes that nature spares us famine. We are not asked to cut open our own stomachs to erase dishonor. Yes, feudal Japan was beautiful. The poetry of Basho still sings. The blossoms still fall each spring in showers of pink, as they did centuries ago. The architecture of temples and castles inspires awe. The art of the tea ceremony still carries a quiet grace. In all these ways, the age gave the world treasures that endure. But beauty cannot erase reality. Behind each poem was a starving farmer. Behind each castle wall was a bloody struggle. Behind each theatre performance were lives weighed down by duty and fear. To live in feudal Japan was to exist in a paradox, surrounded by profound beauty, yet caught in unyielding hardship. It was to honor ancestors while fearing tomorrow. It was to find solace in rituals, entertainment, and nature, while enduring hunger, disease, and war. It was to survive, not in comfort, but in resilience. So tonight, as you rest, take this story as both lullaby and reminder. History is not only the gleam of swords and the elegance of ceremony. It is also the ache of bones bent in the fields, the silence of women whose voices went unheard, the ever-present fear of dishonor, hunger, and death. Feudal Japan endures in our imaginations because it was both beautiful and unforgiving. And if you were to step into that world even for a single day, you would likely find yourself overwhelmed by its weight. The sandals would be too heavy, the code too strict, the hunger too sharp. But through the telling of its story, through remembering both its wonders and its sorrows, we can honor the resilience of those who did endure. They lived where we could not. They endured what we could not. And in their endurance, they left behind a legacy, one that reminds us that beauty and hardship are often bound together, inseparable in the great tapestry of history.